In the grand tapestry of 20th century European royalty, there are names that shine with the brilliance of diamonds: Elizabeth of England, Grace of Monaco, or Victoria of Prussia. But there is another kind of name, a name that tastes of iron and the cold salt of exile. Princess Irene of Greece and Denmark, Duchess of Aosta, was not born to be a ghost. She was born into the heart of the House of Glücksburg, the daughter of King Constantine I and Queen Sophia. She was the sister of 3 kings, the aunt of Queen Sophia of Spain, and a woman of undeniable intellect and poise. Yet, history has a cruel way of erasing the woman to make room for the symbol. After marrying Prince Aimone, she became Duchess of Spoleto, and later Duchess of Aosta when her husband inherited the Aosta title. But there is one title that remains etched in the annals of historical tragedy, a title that was both a crown and a shroud. She became Queen Consort in name when her husband was designated King Tomislav, the second of the independent state of Croatia, though the couple never went to Croatia. A queen who never once set foot on Croatian soil. A queen whose throne was built on the illusions of dictators and the blood of a world at war. Tonight, we peel back the layers of the phantom realm. We look past the silk gowns and the diamond tiaras to see the prisoner beneath. This is the story of a woman whose marriage was a calculated betrayal, whose motherhood was a battle for survival in a Nazi camp, and whose legacy remains a haunting question mark in the ruins of the Axis powers. To understand the Queen of Illusions, we must first look at the soil that raised her. Irene's childhood was not one of stable palaces, but of packed suitcases and the constant threat of revolution. The Greek monarchy in the early 1900s was a pendulum swinging between adoration and execution. Irene's father, King Constantine I, was a man caught between his German sympathies. His wife Sophia was the sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the pro-Allied sentiments of his government. This internal conflict defined Irene's formative years. By the age of 13, she had already tasted the bitterness of exile. In 1917, the family was forced to flee to Switzerland. While other princesses were learning the etiquette of the ballroom, Irene was learning the etiquette of survival. She watched as her family was stripped of their titles, their wealth, and their sense of belonging. This was the first illusion of her life, the idea that a royal title provided safety. When the family was restored to the throne in 1920, it was a short-lived triumph. Just 2 years later, following the disastrous Greco-Turkish War, the monarchy collapsed again. Constantine I abdicated, and Irene found herself once more in the cold embrace of exile, this time in Italy. It was here, in the sun-drenched villas of Florence, that the seeds of her greatest tragedy were sown. In the 1930s, she was considered one of the most eligible young royal women in Europe. She was beautiful, highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and carried the prestige of the Greek crown. But in the world of high politics, a princess is not a person, she is a bridge. Italy, under the iron fist of Benito Mussolini, was looking to expand its influence into the Balkans. Greece, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain its sovereignty against the encroaching shadows of fascism and communism. A marriage between the House of Glücksburg and the House of Savoy seemed like the perfect diplomatic glue. The man chosen for Irene was Prince Aimone of Savoy, the Duke of Spoleto. Aimone was a tall, athletic naval officer, known for his charm and his love of the sea. On the surface, it looked like a match made in heaven. There were whispers of a genuine affection between them, a rare occurrence in political unions. But look closer. This was not a marriage of love, it was a marriage of betrayal. Think of the psychological weight Irene carried. She was the sister of the King of Greece. By marrying into the Italian royal family, she was effectively tethering her fate to a regime that would soon turn its ambitions toward Greece. Mussolini saw Irene as a way to soften the Greek resistance, while the Greek monarchy hoped she could act as a shield against Italian aggression. They were both wrong. Irene was not a shield. She was a hostage. On July 1st, 1939, as the drums of war grew louder across Europe, Irene and Aimone were married in Florence. It was a grand affair, attended by the elite of European royalty. But beneath the celebrations, the cruel machinery of fate was already in motion. Within months of the wedding, Mussolini would launch his disastrous invasion of Greece. Imagine the horror Irene felt, sitting in an Italian palace, hearing the radio broadcast news of Italian bombs falling on the streets of Athens, the streets where she had played as a child. Her husband was an officer in the navy of the aggressor. Her brothers were leading the defense of the victim. The illusion of a happy royal union shattered instantly. Irene was now the wife of the enemy to her own people and a foreign element to her new country. She was trapped in a social and political limbo that would only get darker. In 1941, the tragedy took a turn toward the surreal. The Axis powers, Germany and Italy, had successfully invaded Yugoslavia. In the chaos of the occupation, they created a new entity, the independent state of Croatia. This was not a state born of the people's will. It was a Frankenstein's monster of a country, run by the Ustaše regime, which is widely documented as brutally violent and responsible for mass atrocities during the war. To give this state a veneer of traditional legitimacy, Mussolini and Hitler decided it needed a king. They didn't look for a Croatian. They looked for a Savoy. Mussolini invited, or rather commanded, Aimone to become King Tomislav II. Aimone's reaction was one of pure, unadulterated horror. He was a naval man, a pragmatist. He knew that this kingdom was a death trap. He knew that the Ustaše were butchers. He initially refused, citing his lack of connection to the region and the sheer absurdity of the proposal. But in fascist Italy, a request from the Duce was a command. And so on May 18, 1941, in a ceremony at the Quirinal Palace in Rome, Aimone was officially named King of Croatia. Beside him stood Irene. This is the moment she became the Queen of the Kingdom of Illusions. Consider the psychological landscape of this reign. Irene was now the queen of a land she had never seen. She did not speak the language. She did not know the culture. Most importantly, she did not agree with the ideology. The kingdom existed only on paper and in the propaganda films of the Axis. Irene and Aimone stayed in Italy. They did not travel to Croatia, as Aimone refused to be crowned there, while the Dalmatian territorial dispute between Italy and Croatia remained unresolved. But the world didn't care about the nuances of their refusal. To the Allied powers, to the resistance fighters in the Balkans, and to the suffering people of Greece, Irene was now the Queen of the Butchers. Her name was forever linked to a regime that was carrying out some of the most horrific ethnic cleansings of the war. She wore the title like a crown of thorns. Every official telegram, every diplomatic greeting that addressed her as Your Majesty Queen of Croatia was a reminder of her powerlessness. She was a queen without a throne, a ruler without a people, and a woman without a voice. The tragedy of Irene's life was not just about the titles, it was about the isolation. As the war progressed, the pressure on the Aosta family became unbearable. In Rome and Florence, she was viewed with suspicion. The hardcore fascists didn't trust her because of her Greek blood and her British connections. The anti-fascists hated her because she was part of the royal house that had allowed Mussolini to rise to power. She lived in a beautiful villa, surrounded by servants and luxury, yet she was effectively under house arrest. Her every move was monitored by the Ovra. Her letters were censored. Her conversations were recorded. This was the tragic flaw of her position. Irene's desire to remain a loyal royal and to support her husband meant she had to accept the labels the system forced upon her. She chose the path of quiet endurance, but in doing so, she allowed the illusion to consume her reality. We must ask, why didn't she speak out? Why didn't she renounce the title? The answer lies in the harsh reality of 1942. If she had spoken out, she wouldn't have just been a princess in exile. She would have been a corpse. The Nazis and the Fascists had no qualms about eliminating uncooperative royals. She was staying silent not for herself, but for her husband and the child she was now carrying. In 1943, Irene gave birth to her son, Amedeo, in Florence. Amid wartime air raids, the birth took place under emergency conditions. The birth should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it was a moment of terror. The Queen of Illusions was bringing a new life into a world that was literally collapsing around her. The imagery of this period is haunting. A royal princess, a queen, crouching in the dust and darkness of a basement, clutching an infant, while the very empire that had given her a crown was being turned to rubble. This was the peak of the contradiction. The public still saw her as a privileged member of the Axis elite. In reality, she was a terrified mother who didn't know if she would survive the night. And the worst was yet to come. As Italy began to fracture, as the King of Italy prepared to turn against Mussolini, the kingdom of illusions was about to be replaced by a very real, very physical hell. The Nazis were coming, and they weren't coming to protect the Queen. They were coming to take her. By the summer of 1943, the kingdom of illusions was no longer just a political embarrassment. It had become a death sentence. The sun was setting on Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire, and as the shadows grew long, they fell directly upon Princess Irene. In the luxury of the Villa della Petraia in Florence, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear. Irene, the Queen of Croatia, who had never seen her realm, was now a mother. Her son Amedeo was a mere infant, a tiny life born into a world of falling masonry and sirens. But while Irene focused on the survival of her child, the cruel gears of history were shifting relentlessly. The year 1943 was the tipping point. The Allies had landed in Sicily. The Italian people, tired of hunger and the empty promises of the Duce, were restless. And inside the House of Savoy, a plan was brewing, a plan to cut the ties with Hitler and save the monarchy. But in the world of high-stakes betrayal, someone always has to be the sacrificial lamb. To understand Irene's tragic predicament, one must look at her unyielding sense of royal duty. To Irene, a princess did not run. A princess did not betray her house. She stayed, even when the house was on fire. On September 8, 1943, Italy announced an armistice with the Allies. It was a moment of liberation for many, but for Irene, it was the start of a nightmare. King Victor Emmanuel III and the Prime Minister fled Rome in the dead of night, heading south to the safety of Allied lines. They left behind a country in chaos, and they left behind the junior members of the royal family. Irene's husband, Aymon, was a naval officer. His duty called him to the south to join the king, but Irene was in Florence with a newborn baby. The marriage of betrayal reached its peak here. After the armistice, the family was split amid chaos and German reprisals. Irene remained in Florence with her infant son, while Aymon was elsewhere. Imagine the scene: a darkened villa, the sound of German trucks echoing in the distance, Amoni leaves, promising to send for her, promising that the Germans will respect her status as a royal and as a queen of the Axis. This was the ultimate illusion. Irene stayed in Florence believing that her German blood, her connection to the Kaiser, and her title as Queen of Croatia would act as a shield. She believed the Nazis still viewed her as an ally, but Hitler did not see a queen. He saw a traitorous Italian who happened to be the sister of the King of Greece. To the Führer, the House of Savoy's betrayal was a personal insult that could only be washed away in blood. The transition from Queen of Illusions to political hostage happened in a matter of heartbeats. Following the German occupation of northern Italy, SS units moved to detain members of the Italian royal family who had not escaped. The Germans arrived at Irene's villa not with an invitation to a diplomatic meeting, but with submachine guns. Picture this moment. A woman who was the daughter, sister, and aunt of kings standing in her hallway, clutching her son Amadeo to her chest. The SS officers, men who had likely heard propaganda about the great queen of Croatia, now treated her like common contraband. They gave her minutes to pack. She was stripped of her jewelry. Her letters were seized. Her title was mocked. Irene was forced into a car, driven through the familiar streets of Florence, now a city under occupation, and taken to a holding facility. She was no longer Her Majesty. She was hostage number one. The cruel irony was now complete. The woman who was supposed to be the symbol of the new Balkan order was now a prisoner of the very people who had created that order. The Nazis didn't want her for her leadership. They wanted her as a bargaining chip. She was held as a high-value political hostage, potentially to exert pressure on her husband and the House of Savoy. They used her motherhood as a weapon. They threatened the life of her child. And as the train pulled out of the station, heading north toward the Third Reich, Irene realized that the kingdom of illusions had finally vanished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of barbed wire. The journey from Italy to the German border was a descent into hell. Irene was joined by her sister-in-law, the Duchess of Aosta, and their children. They were packed into a cold, unheated train car. Contrast this with the life Irene was born into. This was a woman who had traveled in private royal carriages, who had been greeted by honor guards in every capital of Europe. Now, she sat on a wooden bench wrapped in a single coat, trying to keep her infant son warm with the heat of her own body. The significance of this moment is profound. What is a queen when she has no country? What is a princess when her family cannot save her? Irene was experiencing the brutal reality of royalty. When the systems of power collapse, the individual is left with nothing but their own inner strength. She was held in Austria, at Hirschegg, reportedly at the Hotel Efen, under guarded detention reserved for prominent prisoners. It was a golden cage that was rapidly turning to lead. At Hirschegg, the grand geopolitical games of Mussolini and Hitler were stripped away, leaving only a raw primitive struggle for survival. Confined to a single, unheated room in the Hotel Efen, the Queen of Illusions faced a brutal reality: hunger and neglect. Irene watched in horror as her infant son Amadeo grew thinner by the day, his ribs pressing against his skin. She spent her nights huddled on a straw mattress, using her own body heat to keep him from freezing. The Gestapo interrogated her daily, weaponizing the marriage of betrayal against her. They taunted her with lies that her husband lived in luxury while she rotted in the snow. But Irene transformed her rigid adherence to royal protocol into a steel-plated armor. She realized that a diamond tiara cannot buy warmth, but a steady, cold gaze could sometimes stop a guard from raising a hand. In that damp cell, she was no longer a figurehead. She was a mother guarding the last flickering flame of her dynasty. While Irene starved in Austria, the puppet state Croatia was dissolving in a sea of blood. The Ustaše regime, which had used Irene's name to justify its existence, was collapsing under the weight of its own atrocities and the relentless advance of Tito's partisans. The nature of Irene's position here is haunting. She was being held as a queen by the Germans, yet the very state she was supposed to rule was a slaughterhouse. She was a queen of peace in a land of genocide. Historical records suggest that during her imprisonment, Irene received occasional reports about the situation in the Balkans. The news was always grim. The Nazis used these reports to taunt her. "Your people are dying, Majesty," they would say. "Your husband has abandoned his navy. Why do you still hold your head so high?" They were trying to induce a psychological collapse, the breaking point where the prisoner loses all sense of self. But Irene's Greek heritage, a lineage that had survived centuries of Ottoman occupation and internal strife, gave her a different perspective. She understood that a crown is a heavy thing, but a name is eternal. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing a princess of Greece weep. As 1945 dawned, the illusion of safety in the remote Alps vanished. The Allied air forces were now targeting even the most secluded German supply lines and mountain passes. Imagine the sheer terror. Irene, holding Amadeo, forced into a dark, damp cellar as the mountains themselves seemed to groan under the impact of the bombs. The guards were terrified. The hierarchy of the camp was breaking down. In these moments of chaos, the nature of the danger shifted. There were whispers among the SS that all special prisoners should be executed before the Allies arrived. The Queen of Illusions was no longer a bargaining chip. She was a witness. And the Nazis did not want witnesses to the way they had treated the royal houses of Europe. This was the marriage of betrayal in its final form. Irene's husband, Imon, was now working with the Allies in the south, helping to clear mines and coordinate naval efforts. His every success for the Allies was a death sentence for Irene in the north. Every time an Italian ship assisted the British, the guards at Hirschegg looked at Irene with more murderous eyes. She lived in a state of constant vibrating fear. Not just the fear of a bomb, but the fear of a silent bullet in the back of the head. She began to sleep in her clothes, her few valuables sewn into her lining, ready to run into the snow at a moment's notice. By April 1945, the end was no longer an illusion. It was a thunderous reality. The guards at Hirschegg began to desert. The special prisoners were left in a state of limbo. Consider the painful paradox of this liberation. Irene was free because the guards had fled, but she was trapped in a war zone with a starving child, surrounded by retreating, desperate German units. She stood at the gates of the camp, watching the roads. She saw the remnants of the master race, haggard, broken men fleeing westward. Among them were officials of the puppet states, men who had once toasted to her health as the Queen of Croatia. Now they didn't even look at her. This was the death of the kingdom of illusions. The titles, the palaces, the diplomatic protocols, they all evaporated in the smoke of the retreating Reich. Irene was no longer a queen. She was a refugee. But as the first Allied tanks, French armored units, rumbled up the mountain path toward Hirschegg, Irene realized that survival was not the same as restoration. She had survived the camp, but the world she was returning to was a graveyard of monarchies. Her brother, King George II of Greece, was fighting for his throne against a communist insurgency. Her husband's family, the House of Savoy, was facing a referendum that would likely end the Italian monarchy forever. Irene had outlived the Nazis, but the cruel gears of history was not done with her. She was about to enter a new era, one where she would be a woman without a country, forever marked by the crown of a kingdom that never was. On a crisp morning in May 1945, the gates of Hersheg swung open. For Princess Irene, the kingdom of illusions had finally met the cold, hard steel of the French First Army. The liberation was not a cinematic explosion of joy. It was a slow, painful awakening. Imagine the scene. A woman who for 2 years had been a number in a Nazi ledger now stood before a French officer. When she introduced herself as the Duchess of Aosta and the Princess of Greece, there was a momentary flicker of confusion. In the chaos of a continent covered in rubble, royal titles felt like relics from a prehistoric age. But Irene's struggle was far from over. Liberation was merely the end of the physical cage. The psychological cage of her reputation as the wife of the Axis was about to tighten its grip. The cruel machinery of the post-war era was a different kind of trap. Irene and her son Amadeo were no longer prisoners of the SS, but they were now persons of interest to the Allied intelligence services. They were moved from the camp to a series of villas and temporary residences across Europe. During this journey, Irene faced a painful paradox that would define her remaining years. To the French and American soldiers who guarded her, she was a curiosity, a high-born lady who had survived the Reich. But to the governments of Greece and Italy, she was a political liability. Her brother, King George II, was struggling to regain his throne in Athens amidst a bloody civil war. He could not afford the optics of welcoming back a sister who had spent the war in the heart of the enemy's camp, married to an Italian duke. In Italy, the House of Savoy was teetering on the edge of a precipice. The public's hatred for Mussolini had spilled over onto the monarchy that had failed to stop him. Irene was a woman without a harbor. She traveled through a fractured Europe clutching her son, realizing that the marriage of betrayal had left her isolated from both her past and her future. In the summer of 1945, Irene finally returned to Italy. The reunion with her husband, Amon, was not the fairy tale ending the kingdom of illusions might have promised. Amon had spent the latter half of the war serving the Allied cause, a desperate attempt to wash the Tomislav, the second stain from his name. When he looked at Irene, he didn't just see his wife. He saw the living reminder of his greatest shame. He saw the woman he had been forced to leave behind to be captured by the Nazis. He saw the child who had almost starved because of his political titles. The public perception was even more brutal. The Italian press, now free from fascist censorship, was relentless. They didn't see a mother who had survived a guarded detention camp for high-profile prisoners. They saw the Queen of Croatia, the woman who had represented the puppet state of a butcher. She felt more judged in her own palace than she had in the Nazi camp. The year 1946 brought the final collapse of the illusion. The Italian people were called to vote, monarchy or republic. For Irene, this was the ultimate reckoning. The House of Savoy was on trial, and the vote was a landslide for the republic. King Umberto II was given hours to leave the country. The kingdom of illusions had been a tragedy, but the kingdom of Italy was now a memory. This moment marked the death of an era. Irene was now in exile, in the very country she had been married off to save. She packed her bags once more. This was the permanent displacement of a woman whose world had been pulverized by the relentless machinery of total war. In 1947, a lifeline appeared. Irene's brother Paul became king of the Hellenes. She returned to Greece, not as a conquering queen, but as a sister seeking sanctuary. However, while she was welcomed into the bosom of the Greek royal family, she was a living reminder of the Axis taint. Queen Frederica, her sister-in-law, was herself a controversial figure, And consequently, Irene's past as the wife of the Axis had to be buried deep beneath the marble floors of Tatoi Palace. Then, in 1948, the final string of the marriage of betrayal was cut. Amoni, the man who had been the Duke of Spoleto, the King of Croatia, and the husband who had left her in the snow, died suddenly in Argentina. He had fled there to start a new life, away from the judgment of Europe. Irene had not gone with him. She had remained in Switzerland and then Belgium, trying to find a school for Amadeo, trying to find a reason to keep her head high. The reality of her widowhood was stark. She was only 44 years old, yet she was a relic. She faced the painful contradiction of mourning a man who had been the source of her greatest suffering, yet was the only person who truly understood the absurdity of their shared fate. Irene was now alone with the legacy of the Axis wife. Her strategy became one of strategic invisibility. She attended state functions, but she rarely gave interviews. She was the Aunt Irene who helped raise the future Queen Sofia of Spain. Behind the scenes, she was the iron-willed matriarch, but to the public she was a footnote. This was the essence of her survival. To live, she had to stop being the protagonist of her own life. Irene's primary focus remained the Amadeo legacy. Her son was the heir to the House of Aosta, a branch of a dynasty that no longer reigned. She had to raise him with the values of a prince, while living in a world that was increasingly Republican. The image of this relationship is poignant. Imagine a mother and son sitting in a villa in Fiesole or Athens, surrounded by heirlooms from a kingdom of illusions. Irene would tell him stories of the Savoy ancestors, of the naval glory of his father, but she had to carefully navigate the marriage of betrayal. How do you explain to a boy that his father left him in a Nazi-controlled city? How do you explain that his title as a Prince of Croatia is a mark of shame to half the world? This was Irene's defining struggle in the post-war years, her obsession with maintaining the dignity of the name. She poured all her suppressed trauma into the molding of Amadeo. She was a demanding, strict mother, driven by the fear that if they slipped even an inch in their decorum, the world would swallow them whole. She wasn't just raising a son, she was defending a fortress. Many historians overlook Irene's influence on the next generation of European royals. As the aunt of Princess Sofia, who would become the Queen of Spain, Irene was a constant source of counsel. Sofia, too, would face a life of political instability and a marriage that required immense endurance. History often repeats itself, and Irene saw the patterns. She saw the inherent conflict of being a royal in a modern world. When Sofia prepared to move to Spain, a country then under the dictatorship of Franco, Irene was the one who understood the cost of marrying into a kingdom of illusions. She taught Sofia the art of the royal mask, how to remain impassive while the world debates your legitimacy. Irene's presence at the great royal gatherings of the 60s was a masterclass in psychological containment. She stood amongst the reigning monarchs, a survivor of the camps, a widow of a puppet king, yet she never let the mask slip. She was the Queen of Illusions, who had mastered the ultimate illusion that she was perfectly fine. History, it seems, was not done with Irene's exiles. In 1967, a military junta, the regime of the colonels, seized power in Greece. Her nephew, King Constantine II, attempted a counter-coup and failed, forcing the entire family into exile. For Irene, this was the third time she had been forced to flee her home with nothing but what she could carry. The nature of this final exile was different. She was no longer the young princess of 1917 or the captive queen of 1943. She was an elderly woman, her health beginning to fail, witnessing the final collapse of the Greek monarchy. She returned to Italy after years of exclusion, living quietly as a private citizen following the collapse of the Savoy monarchy. The kingdom of illusions had finally reached its end. There were no more titles to defend, no more puppet thrones to avoid. She lived her final years in a modest apartment in Fiesole, near Florence. The woman who'd been a queen on paper was now a ghost in the city she once ruled as a duchess. But the silence was about to be broken. In her final years, the marriage of betrayal and the horrors of her capture would finally be whispered about in the corridors of history. The Queen of Illusions was preparing to leave the stage, but the tragedy she left behind would become a warning for every royal house in Europe. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Princess Irene lived in a state of quiet anonymity. To the locals in Fiesole, she was the principessa who lived quietly, a woman of impeccable manners and deep, unreadable silences. To the world of international politics, she was a forgotten relic. The kingdom of illusions had been archived in history books, but for Irene, it remained a living, breathing weight in the room. The threats in her life had shifted from the external threats of the SS and the Fascists to the internal erosion of time and memory. She was now a woman who had outlived her husband, her throne, and the very concept of the world she was born to lead. Let us look at her final sanctuary. Irene's apartment was not a palace. It was a museum of her own survival. Every object was tethered to a reality that no longer existed. There was the silver tea set from Athens, saved from the 1922 exile. There were the letters from Amon, written in the frantic days before the marriage of betrayal was consumed by the war. This was the reality of her old age, the minimalism of a survivor. When you have spent nights in a bomb shelter and years in a guarded detention camp for high-profile prisoners, the luxury of a palace feels like an unnecessary burden. Irene practiced a life of absolute simplicity. She stripped away the pretenses. She was no longer interested in being a queen. She was interested in being a witness to the truth, even if she only spoke that truth to the walls. She spent her afternoons walking the winding paths of Tuscany. Imagine the irony of this scene. A woman who was technically the Dowager Queen of Croatia and the Duchess of Aosta, standing in a grocery line, her hands, the same hands that once held the fate of a Balkan alliance, now carefully counting out Lyre for bread and wine. As the 1970s progressed, a new wave of historical scrutiny swept through Europe. Documentary filmmakers and historians began to dig into the horrors of the independent state of Croatia. The name Tomislav II began to appear more frequently in accounts of the era. This was the tragic cost of her silence. By choosing not to tell her story, by choosing not to publicly denounce the puppet kingdom that had used her name, she allowed the cruel passage of history to brand her by default. To the younger generation, she wasn't a victim of the Nazis. She was the widow of a collaborator. Every time a news report detailed the crimes of the Ustaše, Irene felt the marriage of betrayal tighten around her neck. She was trapped in a state of psychological haunting. She could still smell the damp air of the Hersheg camp. Yet the world saw her as a beneficiary of the very regime that had imprisoned her. This was the ultimate kingdom of illusions, a reality where the victim is mistaken for the villain because she is too proud to explain her scars. Despite her public invisibility, Irene remained the iron matriarch of the royal diaspora. Her nephew, Constantine II was in exile. Her niece Sophia was navigating the treacherous transition of Spain from the dictatorship of Franco to a democracy. Irene was the only one among them who truly knew what it meant to lose everything and survive. She became a silent counselor. She taught them the strategy of the void, how to exist when your title is a question mark. Consider the irony in her advice. She told the younger royals to be modern, to be relatable, while she herself remained a rigid monument to the 19th century ideals of her parents. She knew that the era of the kingdom of illusions was over, and a new, more transparent world was coming. She wanted to ensure that Sophia and Constantine never had to experience the tragedy that had crushed her own youth. She was the shield that her own husband had failed to be for her. By the early 1970s, Irene's health began to fail. The years of malnutrition in the camp and the chronic stress of her exiles had taken their toll. She began to suffer from respiratory issues and a heart that was simply tired of beating against the tide of history. In these final months, her memories became a kaleidoscope. She would often speak in Greek, the language of her heart, drifting back to the gardens of Tatoi and the laughter of her brothers. The queen of illusions was finally letting the illusions go. The titles, the palaces, the bitter memories of the marriage of betrayal, they were all being washed away by the tides of age. She died on April 15th, 1974, in a hospital in Florence. Her death was a quiet affair, a small headline in a world that was busy with the Cold War and the energy crisis. She was buried in the Basilica of Superga, the resting place of the House of Savoy. Even in death, she was a contradiction. A princess of Greece, buried in an Italian tomb, having been the queen of a Croatian phantom. The kingdom of illusions had finally closed its gates, but the story of the woman who survived it was only just beginning to be understood. Death, for most, is the final chapter. But for Princess Irene of Greece, death was merely the beginning of her true restoration. For decades, the kingdom of illusions had shielded the world from the horrors that had governed her life. But as the 20th century drew to a close, the archives began to speak. The Axis wife was about to be unmasked as a survivor of a psychological and physical terror that few could imagine. In the late 1980s and 90s, declassified documents from the German and Italian secret services began to surface. They revealed a reality that Irene had been too proud or too traumatized to ever discuss. They revealed that the Queen of Croatia was never a collaborator. She was a high-value hostage who had been used to torture the House of Savoy into submission. Let us examine the harrowing details found within these files. We see the unvarnished truth of Nazi cruelty. The documents reveal that during her time at Hirschegg, Irene was not treated with the royal courtesy the propaganda suggested. The Gestapo files show that her son, Amadeo, was used as a powerful psychological weapon. The marriage of betrayal was weaponized against her daily. The guards were instructed to tell her that her husband, Aimoni, had died in a naval accident, or that he had signed a decree divorcing her to save his own skin. This was the system's cruelty at its most sadistic. They wanted to break her spirit so she would agree to become a puppet leader for a loyalist Italian faction. But the records show a woman of terrifying resolve. In the transcripts of her interrogations, Irene's responses are short, cold, and impeccably regal. She refused to acknowledge the authority of her captors. Her stubborn royal pride was the only thing that kept her from the abyss. Perhaps the most significant revelation after her death was the total disconnect between Irene and the state she ruled. While the Ustaše were committing atrocities in her name, Irene was living under the constant threat of execution. There are scattered reports of Irene trying to intercede for Greek and Italian prisoners of war through her connections in the Red Cross, often at great personal risk. She used her kingdom of illusions as a shield to hide her clandestine efforts to help those suffering under the same regimes that had crowned her. She was a queen who hated her crown, using its weight to hammer at the bars of the very cage she was trapped in. The ultimate paradox of Irene's life was realized through her son. Amadeo grew up to be a man of immense character, a world traveler, and a fierce defender of his mother's memory. The proof of this legacy is found in Amadeo's own accounts. He spoke of the hardships of his childhood, not as a prince in a palace, but as a boy whose mother taught him that his name was his only true possession. Amadeo's life was the restoration Irene never had. He reclaimed the Aosta name from the shadow of the Axis wife label. He showed the world that the child who had almost starved in an Austrian camp had survived to become a symbol of a new democratic European nobility. Irene's obsession with the legacy had worked. She had sacrificed her own happiness to ensure that her son would not be a ghost of the fallen crown, but a man of the real world. As we look back at the life of Princess Irene, we must confront the emptiness of her titles. What does it mean to be a queen of nothing? What does it mean to be the bridge between two enemies? Irene was the ultimate paradox. She was a woman of peace trapped in a bloody puppet kingdom. She was a mother who gave birth in a war zone. She was a princess who learned that a title is a target. Her life warns us of the ruthless nature of political marriages, how they turn human beings into symbols, and symbols into targets. She reminds us that the kingdom of illusions is not a relic of the past. It is a trap that remains set for anyone who allows their identity to be defined by the masks the world forces them to wear. But Irene also showed us the power of the royal mask. By refusing to let the mask slip, by refusing to show her pain to those who didn't deserve to see it, she maintained a core of humanity that the Nazis and the Fascists could never touch. She was the queen of illusions, but she was the master of her own reality. We have traveled through 80 years of shadows. We have seen the palaces of Athens, the bomb shelters of Florence, and the barbed wire of the Austrian Alps. We have seen a woman transformed from a princess of the blood into a queen of illusions, and finally, into a ghost of a forgotten era. Now, we must face the final restoration, not of a throne, but of a soul. The story of Princess Irene of Greece is not just a footnote in the history of World War II. It is a profound meditation on the cost of identity when it is traded for the ruthless games of statecraft. As the world moves further away from the 20th century, the figure of Irene stands as a lighthouse, warning us of the conflicts that arise when we allow the world to define who we are. In recent years, the kingdom of illusions has been reevaluated by a new generation of scholars. They no longer see the Axis wife, they see the hostage of the Mediterranean. Today, historians offer a new perspective, one of radical empathy. We now understand that Irene's rigid silence was not an admission of guilt, but a final act of resistance. By refusing to play the victim, she denied the dictators the satisfaction of her tears. Her legacy is no longer found in the dusty propaganda reels of the Ustaše. It is found in the eyes of her grandchildren, and in the democratic stability of the royal houses she influenced. Her life teaches us that we all wear masks. We all navigate systems that seek to exploit us. But like Irene, we have a choice. We can let the cruelty of the world consume us, or we can hold on to our dignity, our fatal weakness turned into our greatest strength. Princess Irene of Greece died, as she lived, with a silence that spoke volumes. She is no longer a footnote. She is a woman who finally found the truth. No crown is as heavy as the one you are forced to wear, and no victory is as sweet as the one you win simply by remaining yourself.